So in this video, I will be talking about different examples of natural selection that can be seen in many different ways amongst many different species. But first, what is natural selection? Natural selection is a mechanism of evolution when organisms that are more adapted to their environment survive and then pass on the genes that contributed to their survival. These genes that contribute to their survival can then be called favorable traits. So my first example I'll be talking about are Darwin's finches. Darwin's finches are a classic example of natural selection. The ancestor of these finches is still found today on the mainland of South America. These finches made it to the Galapagos Islands and began branching off to different islands. On these different islands, they faced different environmental pressures, such as one island may have a concentration of insects, whereas another island may have a surplus of nuts and seeds. With these varied pressures on their respective islands, it causes different traits such as a certain body size or a certain beak size and shape to be favorable, like how a broad and blunt beak is better for breaking open nuts and seeds, while a longer, sharper beak might be better for hunting insects. So on these different islands, the birds with beaks that aren't suited to the pressure died out. Like if a bird with a broad and blunt beak was on an island where it had to hunt insects, it would not be successful in nourishing itself. And while beak shape and size is generally the focus, the body size of the bird also contributes a lot to this selective process. As an example, if a larger finch was on an island that had a surplus of nuts and seeds, it would either have to eat a greater amount of these nuts and seeds compared to a smaller bird, or it would not have enough sustenance to survive. And with these harsh pressures, the birds adapted to their respective island and now make up 18 different species of the Galapagos. However, this adaptation would not have been able to happen if it weren't for random variation and mutation, which gives way for the different beaks to appear and then be passed on when useful. When if it wasn't useful, it would not be passed on. So these two images show the many different types of beak from that first common ancestor. Now, the next example of natural selection I will be talking about is giraffes. The giraffe we see today are much different from their ancestors. Many sources say they resemble something closer to a deer or an antelope, as they are much shorter with a much shorter neck than the giraffe we know today. However, by using Darwin's finches as an example, it is most likely due to random variation that certain giraffes had longer necks, as well as the possibility of an environmental pressure such as needing more reliable food sources. This longer neck then allowed them to eat from a wider variety of food sources, such as acacia trees, which are very beneficial to the giraffe and today make up a majority of their diet. With this greater accessibility to a broader variety of food, this longer neck then becomes a favorable trait. For the giraffes, since this variation, they are able to better utilize more resources around them. This trait is then passed on, and what is interesting about giraffes is that the size of the individual vertebrae increase to extend their necks. And this isn't really relevant, but I for one used to think that they had more vertebrae, so that was interesting for me. But anyways, this first image over here is an okapi, which is the same family as the giraffe. And while I couldn't find many images of the ancestor of the giraffe, I figured this would give a general idea, as well as the second image. This shows more of Lamarck's theory of a more active evolution. And while that's not what I'm talking about in this particular presentation, I figured this could give a general idea of the evolution of the shorter neck, shorter body to the giraffe we know today. And my final example are pesticide-resistant insects. And while this is technically artificial selection, since it does involve human interference, I did want to include this as one of my examples, as I find this resistance very interesting since it does snowball into a much larger issue/controversy in the grand scheme of it. But since this is relatively more of a modern adaptation, I found this to be really interesting to talk about. But this image that I have here perfectly summarizes how this comes about. So this resistance commonly happens when the same pesticide or general deterrent is used, but can begin with the first use of whatever pesticide or deterrent is being used. So this happens when after the first use, a small population can still survive due to a possible mutation allowing immunity, or if it was a repeated use, what is known as quote-unquote resistance mechanisms, but generally a difference in their genes. And just like the finches, this gene is passed on by that surviving population, allowing the next generation to have that same resistance, ergo then being passed on to all the generations after them. So these are my references for the respective slides, and I hope you enjoyed it.